George was the David E. Finley Fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery, and he's lectured at museums and universities worldwide. He's also, and I was part of this organization when it started, a founding trustee of the Association of Art Museum Curators, which was one of the very first professional organizations for curators. And he served as the president when I first joined. In 2005, he was elected a Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters by the Republic of France and was named an officier in 2012. His first exhibition at the Kimbell, and I can tell you, I was working and living and working in Dallas at that time, and when it was announced that George was coming back to Texas, there was this huge cheer that went up over North Texas because he has many, many friends there and fans. His first exhibition at the Kimbell was Faces of Impressionism, Portraits from the Musée d'Orsay, Gustave Caillebotte, another obscure artist, and followed by Monet, the early years, and followed by the sequel, Monet, the late years, and Renoir, the body and the senses. And I joke about that idea of, but in terms of what George really does with these artists who we think we know, his particular genius is to tease out themes and ideas about these artists, again, whose work we think we know everything. And in fact, George shows us just the opposite. The talk that George will be giving tonight is on Bonnard and Bonnard's Worlds, this magnificent exhibition that he curated that was at the Phillips Collection and then the Kimbell Art Museum where he works. And I won't go into it because you all read the little intro on the website, but I will say what is wonderful is that our Bonnard painting, The Garden with the Small Bridge, from 1937, which was a bequest of Wright Luddington in 1993, was a signal part of that installation. I am really very pleased to welcome my friend George Shackelford. Thank you.
Charlie, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here in Santa Barbara. It's been many, many years since I was here, and I had forgotten how pretty it is. And it's really, even with a slightly gray day today, it was a great pleasure to be around town and seeing this wonderful museum. Let's go ahead and start. And I wonder, can y'all take the light down on me a little bit? I feel there. That's wonderful. Much better, and I think it's better for the screen too. Thank you. I want to thank you all for the loan of this marvelous painting called Garden with Small Bridge from 1937 that Charlie referred to. It is a glorious painting by Bonnard, and I think one that most of the visitors to the exhibition, even the ones who consider themselves Bonnard fanatics, found a surprise and a delight in the exhibition. At the center of the painting is Marthe Bonnard and one of the couple's 6 or 7 dachshunds, all of which were named Poussette. And more about the subject matter of this painting later. But the exhibition Bonnard's Worlds came about from our purchase at the Kimbell in 2015 of this 2018, of this wonderful painting by Bonnard, a view of Le Canet. And it is a view of the town in which he died. Here is the painting as a whole. You saw it in the exhibition there at the Kimbell. It was actually at the Kimbell last fall and into January and is now at the Phillips Collection. So if you want to take the red eye to Washington, you still can see it through the month of May. At the center of the painting is Bonnard's house, just here, behind this green tree. And in the lower right-hand corner of the painting is Bonnard, lying down. He painted always in a suit, and he is here like some kind of god of nature in this landscape. And I thought, well, why would you paint a painting like this for someone else? Because we know that it was a commission And I thought, why would you paint a picture about your own life and your own house for someone besides yourself? And I got to thinking and looking more into it, and I thought, well, of course you do that, because basically Bonnard never paints anything that isn't in some way or another about the worlds in which he lives. And that became the sort of organizing principle of the exhibition. We began the show in this landscape, in the big, wide landscape that any of us could have walked into, and we end the exhibition in the most private space, having gone from landscape to garden to terrace to within the house to deeper within and into the bedroom, the bath, and finally the mirror in which Bonnard contemplates his own image alone. The exhibition began with views of Paris, like this one from the MFA Boston. This is the view from Bonnard's first apartment in Paris, seen at night or in the day. And it's filled with wonderful little details, little anecdotal details of what's going on in the picture. It's absolutely terrific little an omnibus here, and early motor car here. Bonnard had a car just as soon as he could get himself one, shortly after 1900, and was a fanatic of it. He drove his car back and forth across France, and he drove it out to Normandy, where he rented a house, this one here, and then bought it. He started renting in 1910 and bought it in 1912. And this landscape, the house is still there. It's going to be restored and turned into some kind of center for Bonnard studies. The house and its landscape became the background of a painting that he made, again on commission. This is one of the rare paintings in Bonnard's work that has if you will, a literary theme. It's Adam and Eve. The Bible is the theme. And in the Garden of Eden, he transposes Eden into Normandy and puts the Valley of the Seine here in the background into this image of himself as the first man, his wife, the first woman, and Normandy, the first landscape. This notion of painting the world around him, going out into the landscape and creating works based on what he's seen, but always painting them back in the studio. He keeps maybe a pocket notebook, some little scraps of paper, a pencil. He goes and makes very, very cursory little sketches. Sometimes they're just little squiggles of lines with a note or two about color. A little square will often take the place of a whole group of buildings. He's just telling himself, this is what we're going to paint. So here, looking out onto the Bay of Cannes, because Le Cannet, his house, is a northern suburb of Cannes. There's the Bay of Cannes and the mountains of the Estoril here. And this was painted in the 1920s, and he's still painting the same landscape in the 1940s. This one from a private collection in Dallas, painted the year before he died. From this landscape, and remember please this little pathway here, this is Bonnard's house again, right here, with the red roof this time. This marvelous patch of paint, pink ground with calligraphic lines of oil paint on top of it, I think is supposed to be a wall. And then down the hill, the little town of Le Cannet in the distance. So remember that view and that landscape, because I'm going to bring it up again in a moment. But from the wide landscape, we were invited into Bonnard's gardens. And here the garden at Le Clos in the southeast of France, in the Dauphiné, as it was called then, and into the world of his family. Here's his sister playing croquet with probably their cousin Berthe, wearing the checkered dress just here, their father, and André's husband. They're a man named Claude Terrace, who is a composer. This little intimate family group brought together and juxtaposed with these sort of imaginary fairy ladies dancing in the background, is typical of the kind of work that Bonnard executed as a member of the Nabi group, this group of young artists who were followers of Gauguin. They included Maurice Denis and Edouard Vuillard, who were terrifically interested in Japanese art, in the graphic arts in general, in decoration, and in paintings that were extremely flat, as you can see this one is. As in the Twilight, the picture I just showed you, this painting from the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown features a cloth dress where the cloth is absolutely flat, completely flattened out, and it becomes just pattern. The garden as a setting for family activity is one of the themes that Bonnard pursues avidly across his lifetime. So from this painting, for instance, we could go to one like this, which was painted in a rented house that Bonnard and his wife, Marthe, took in the area not too far from Argenteuil in France, down the river from Paris. Or moving back a little bit, back into the garden at Le Clos with this painting of the family in the garden from 1901. And there's probably his grandmother. And these children, though their ages don't seem to all match up, are some of the 6 surviving children that André and Claude Terrace had together. Bonnard had never had children of his own, but he had lots of nieces and nephews. And then we come to your painting, The Garden with Small Bridge, which I asked to borrow, fully thinking that it in fact represented a garden. But I'm going to tell you it's not a garden as such. It is an outdoor space for people to enjoy, but it's a little bit more than that. It is, however, absolute proof of the fact that Bonnard likes to paint the same picture again and again. Because look at the resemblances between these two paintings that are more than 30 years apart. They hung next to each other in the exhibition, as you'll see in just a second. But there are little things like the upraised hands of this little girl here. And then these little tiny figures, do you see them? These 2 children here with their hands upraised. The way a path just sort of goes straight through the painting as over on both sides. This pointer, I'm not sure how effective it is. The sense of the flattening of the landscape and the pushing of the background up towards the foreground plane, common to both. And they all were displayed on a wall together. This was a very beautiful wall in the exhibition. Many thanks to you for the loan of The Garden with Small Bridge. And this painting that hung next to them truly is a garden, and it's the garden of the house around the garden around the house that he bought at Le Canet that I showed you in our first slide. It really is a tangle of undergrowth and sort of casually planted flowers. But there's something a little bit different, and as I began to look at your painting and to study it more carefully, it made me think of something that was important, which is that Bonnard went on a walk every day of his life. Before he started to paint, and actually before he had breakfast, he would go on a walk. And one of the places he liked to walk was up the hill from his house. There's the house, and here he is lying up the hill from it, looking down on his house. The house still stands today in this behind this tangle of foliage here. That's the garage at the left, the little staircase going up into the garden of the house. It's on the side of a hill, and in the old days, it sat on the hill by itself. There it is, this little house right here. And now, of course, it is surrounded by holiday homes. In the some 90 years since your painting was painted, this landscape has changed beyond recognition. And through the landscape, right around in here, so still farther up the hill for Gauguin, There flows, now beneath the ground, covered over by development, but nonetheless still flowing, a canal. A canal that rises out of a river in the Maritime Alps and carries fresh drinking water all the way down to the city of Cannes, which it still does. It was instituted in the 19th century, and it still goes all the way down. And I think that that is what this is. This channel here, with its stone sides, a little bridge in the background and a little bridge here in the foreground, is high up, because look over here at the lower left-hand corner. Do you see the staircase going down? You could read it as going up, but it's definitely going down. And this woman and her child are perhaps about to descend that staircase and go down that landscape that I showed you, both in the view from Fort Worth and the view from the private collection in Dallas, going down, down, down the hill towards Paris. But it was a place where people used to love to walk in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so there's Marthe walking with her dog. There's the woman and the staircase. And then here is the telltale small bridge of the title of your painting, Garden with Small Bridge. And I think it is one of the concrete bridges built over the Canal de Siagne. And there's one as photographed in the 1920s, a little before Bonnard painted his painting. And you see the pathway through the grass and the channeled canal along the side. Now, although the canal near Bonnard's house has been covered over, there are long stretches of it that are still open and where people still do go on promenades. And that, I think, is what you see. Well, these are both views of the canal. And here, I think, is one that I think will sort of suggest to you what I think the painting here in Santa Barbara actually represents. I'm not suggesting a title change, but if you want to put it on a label, you can. So from Garden with Small Bridge to a true garden, we move to the other end of this garden, the garden down the hill from the canal, and go to the end of the garden facing the city, and we find Bonnard painting one of his most enchanting views of a terrace. We're now going to be on the terraces of houses. Here's the Palm from 1926, the summer they bought this house. And it extends a process in Bonnard's art of painting views of people near the house, but not inside the house. Here's Marthe, his by then wife. They married only in 1925, but they'd known each other since 1893. Here Marthe is. Here is the family that she very seldom met. This is his sister Andrée in pink and her brood, along with their friends, the Prudhoms, in The Woman in Blue and White and The Man in the Straw Hat. Here's the terrace of his house, of their house in Normandy. You can't see the Seine very clearly, but I can tell you that if you're standing on this terrace, you see the river at the bottom of the garden very clearly indeed. And this magnificent painting sort of sets the standard for these large-scale views of the landscape seen from abroad. This one painted about 1918. About the same time, he's painting this view, probably inspired by a landscape in the south of France, we think maybe around Grasse, but a garden that he did not live in himself. More pertinent are these two paintings of terraces. The one at the right was begun in around 1921, we think. It shows at the center a woman named Renée Montchaty. Renée Montchaty was a friend of Bonnard and Marthe, a close friend. Bonnard and Renée went off to Rome at the same time. They did, however, send postcards back to Marthe, whom you might have missed Marthe, actually. Here she is, right here. Clearly not the center of attention. And it is perhaps Renée's presence in their lives that sufficiently goaded Marthe into demanding that they have a civil ceremony and get married in 1925. It is in the aftermath of that René Montchety was found dead, presumably a suicide. Now, this painting was almost certainly conceived. It was certainly conceived before René Montchety died in 1925, which means that it could not have been painted on the terrace in the south of France. It had to have been the terrace in Normandy. But look at the way the light here in the background acts just like the light in this painting, which is very definitely the terrace at Le Canet. And it might not surprise you to then learn that the painting on the right was begun in 1921 or so, put away after René Montchety died, and brought out only again after Marthe died in 1942, to be finished probably around 1945, at the same time that he's painting the vertical picture that you see on the left. It's one of the most sort of thrillingly peculiar paintings in Bonnard's entire world. That sense of looking at and being looked at from within a painting is something that doesn't happen a lot in Bonnard, but happens just enough for you to count it and begin to notice it. And here in 1921, he shows you a kind of variant of the picture that he painted in 1913 of Marthe leaning into the window of their dining room in the country. And this was the first picture in a gallery of paintings that dealt with the notion of seeing the landscape from within a dwelling. So whether it was their house, this is their house in Normandy, or the house in the south of France, whether it was a rented hotel room or a house rented for a season someplace else, Bonnard was fascinated by what you could do with the view of the landscape seen through an opening of some kind, a window or a door. This is maybe the most magnificent of them all from the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, really one of his great masterpieces. But there are, and there you get a sense, there's the landscape of the Seine that you've seen so many times out the back. Another group of these came from the Tate Museum in London, the Bowl of Milk, painted of a hotel room in Antibes that the couple rented just after the close of World War I. They spent the end of 1918 and the beginning of 1919 overlooking the sea in Antibes. We don't know where this was painted, which window, but it is absolutely if you will, the poster child for some advice that I'm going to give you about Bonnard's paintings, which is to always watch the corners, because there are things that happen on the edges and the corners of his paintings that are absolutely essential. And here you see probably René playing handsies with a little cat. I didn't count all the cats and dogs in Bonnard's worlds, but there were a lot of them. At this painting from the Museum of Modern Art is Marthe again, but look, if you thought she was sidelined in the painting of her and René Montchety, look at her, she's about to fold herself into the wallpaper at the left here. This is a stunning, stunning landscape with this incredibly elegant view out onto the garden, absolutely redolent of his friend Henri Matisse, whose work you can also see reflected in this wonderful painting from the Guggenheim in New York. In a painting like this, though, I think you also should start thinking about seeing not only reflected Matisse's inspiration, but you should see in this a painting without which Richard Diebenkorn could hardly have evolved in the way that he did. And we know that Diebenkorn, for instance, along with Rothko and a number of other of the abstract expressionists, Barnett Newman, for instance, were fascinated by Bonnard when they saw his work in depth in 1948 in the big posthumous retrospective held at the Museum of Modern Art. Out of the room in the upper, a little boudoir on the upper floor of the house in Le Canet, Bonnard liked to paint the window again and again. Here's one in a private collection from Dallas. Here's one in a private collection in New York. And in this painting, I'll point out to you the details of the room. There's a doorway here, a French door, with two glass doors, a little balcony, a radiator, a white door, that's the white door just over at this edge. You can catch the very edge of it at the edge of the image. That is reflecting light onto the wall above the radiator, where, by the way, it turns into a Rothko, painted in the 1930s. And to the right of the open window is a mirror. And in that mirror, you see reflected the back of Marthe Bonnard's head and the face of Pierre Bonnard. So not only have you got a window as an opening, but you have a mirror as an opening. And going back, you will realize that the dog here is in the mirror, not being seen directly in the room. And that same idea is held in this painting, again from a New York private collection, in which the doorway has been closed. So these three paintings, painted over the course of a decade, here they are from left to right. In the exhibition, we installed them from right to left. And they provided a wonderful point to stop and study and to think about what an artist can do with one visual point of inspiration. Because the room was exactly the same room every time. Across time was not that, it was literally they were all painted in the 1930s. And they all basically showed the same thing, but look how very different the three paintings are. And look also at how different, I'll back up here, look how different the conception of what is outside is from picture to picture to picture. You know it's the same view, but it's not the same in any of Bonnard's paintings. Bonnard would love to say something like, people talk all the time about surrendering to nature, but you have to surrender to the painting. And what he meant was that the painting has needs and laws that are greater than your obligation to rendering nature. And even though Bonnard begins with something that he has seen in every work of art that he ever paints, and he fixes that memory in his head and transposes it onto the canvas for our study and our pleasure, but also to intrigue us and to make us think. And when you see paintings like these side by side by side, as we did in Fort Worth, then you have a chance to see the artist thinking a bit and challenging you to think as well. Among the last paintings Bonnard ever painted is this magnificent view out a window. This is the window of his studio in the house in Le Canet, painted depicting a moment at the end of winter when the mimosa trees begin to blossom as the sort of harbingers of spring, these beautiful golden yellow flowers that bloom on these tall bush-like trees in the south of France. And they inspired him to paint this vivid yellow painting of the view outside of the studio window. Now, we think the painting was begun in the late 1930s, but we know it wasn't finished until the autumn of 1946, when it was finished actually not in the studio where it was conceived, but in fact in Fontainebleau, about 40 miles from Paris, way up in the north of France, where he had taken the painting to the home of one of his nephews before exhibiting it at the chateau in Fontainebleau, where the nephew was the curator. So we know that the final touches were put on this painting at that very much later date. And without the example, first of all, it was not the season for mimosa blossoms, and it was not the place that they were ever blooming. He could work on the painting. He could take a painting from the south of France to Normandy, back again, vice versa. He rolled paintings up and stuck them on the top of his car and drove them all across France, including one that he lost. So there's just the hope that someday, we don't know what it was, that someday somebody can say, well, my grandmother found this on the side of the road, and it just might be true. It just might be true. But you can see here that touch and that fascination for color. He actually once said, you can never have too much yellow, and it's true. And from this view of the landscape seen through the window, we turned our backs on the window in the exhibition and turned our attention back down towards the intimate life of the interior. Bonnard and Vuillard and even Maurice Denis were sometimes called intimists for the fact that they painted intimate subject matter. And Bonnard didn't much care for this term, but acknowledged that it might have some usefulness if by intimist you could be construed as meaning someone who found inspiration and pleasure in, I think he called it, the normal acts of everyday life. And here, gathering his sister and her children and his mother around the table, and their cat, by the way, who is here, but in a very, very strange and peculiar and perhaps even slightly unsettling image, you get the sense of the fact that a family meal might not always be exactly hunky-dory, even with the children present, because there we are, seated here with this bottle of wine and these oranges in front of us. Here we are reflected in the spherical brass reservoir in which the oil for the lamp, the descending lamp on a pulley, was held. This notion of the intimate detail, the intimate theme, and the ordinary act of everyday life is something that begins in Bonnard and Vuillard and Maurice Denis in the 1890s and holds on in Bonnard all the way to the end of his career. Take, for example, this beautiful painting from the 1920s, or teens rather, from Tate called Coffee, in which you see Marthe drinking a cup of espresso after dinner coffee. Her maid puts down, I think, a little glass of an aperitif, a digestif of some kind, a little glass of brandy perhaps, or an eau de vie. There's a coffee pot and an empty coffee cup here. This is Pierre's place. And then there is one of the poussettes placed with the dog that gets away with everything. Its back paws on the mother's lap or down on her thigh, perhaps, and front paws wide up on the table, lined straight up like a railroad track going right up to that dog on the pattern of the checkered tablecloth. Look at the beautiful shadow cast by the back of the chair, the open back of the chair, that blue shadow cast over the brownish border of what I think may be a painted tapestry by his friend Maurice Denis in the background. No one I know has explained happily the strip of patterned something at the right, which is not the other border of the tapestry in the background, but relates to the border of the tapestry in the background in some way. And it indicates to us that we are at some kind of remove, I think, if we are going to perceive it as perhaps the edge of a curtain in between two rooms. Hard to know what it is. And it might just be abstract. But Bonnard's fascination with these scenes of intimacy is particularly beautifully brought out in this painting. And I'm afraid I didn't put a detail in, so you'll have to go to the Phillips Collection and see it. It was Duncan Phillips's first purchase of a work by Bonnard. He bought something like 15 great paintings by Bonnard over the course of his lifetime, beginning with this one, which he bought in 1925, and extending up into the 40s, though he concentrated on Bonnard's work from about 1900 to about 1935 or so. And this one of Marthe and one of the dogs is as close to a maternity picture that Bonnard ever paints, and was beautiful in juxtaposition with the coffee in the exhibition in Fort Worth. Charlie and I were talking before the talk began about the joy of bringing things together from far and wide to have them act on our emotions and our intellects together in ways they can't in a book, and they can't when in reality, unless you bring them together in the same place, which is, of course, what a lone exhibition is all about. And whether it was bringing your painting into juxtaposition with the one from Zurich and learning something about Bonnard's consistency across time, or in this case, bringing three paintings together that show the same theme in three radically different ways. Because at center is a painting called The White Cupboard from Kansas City. At the left was a painting called The Red Cupboard, which belongs to a couple who live in New Hampshire, but they keep the painting in the Freeport in Geneva. And at the right is this painting from the Museum of Modern Art, given them by David Rockefeller back in the 1960s, and never on view. But they were brought together, and in the exhibition, you could see that the red cupboard represents this section of this cupboard, and this still life, a basket seen within a cupboard, which previously was called Still Life Reflected in a Mirror, till I convinced them that there was no mirror involved. It's simply this corner of the central cupboard that you see there. And hanging them side by side, again, made us all be able to realize that something as ordinary as a kitchen cupboard could spur Bonnard's imagination. Wildflowers, gathered from the field perhaps across the road from his house in Normandy. A dachshund sitting on a chair. Or a cat, her kitten, and another dachshund in front of this very Matisse-like tabletop of music and books. A very peculiarly shaped, extremely vertical view of his studio in Paris with a sculpture by Mayol and a bouquet of anemones, or the fireplace in that room with the open window on the second floor of his house where the radiator was and the Rothko. If you turn to the right, or excuse me, to the left rather, you'll see this fireplace. It's still very much there. The inside of the fireplace, the way around the coal grate, is bright white, and yet Bonnard has infused it with a golden yellow color because, as he said, you can never have too much yellow. Fruits arranged on a table, exquisitely painted, this belonging to the Cleveland Museum of Art. Or a tabletop arrangement. This is the table in the big living room, dining room on the ground floor of the house in the south of France. The cupboard is actually just here, and the table in the foreground is the one you saw in the picture of the cupboard, habitually draped with a red woolen cloth on which he would then lay a linen or cotton cloth, in this case a checked one. The checks seeming to have a life of their own. They're not behaving very clearly. But there are other things, other odd things that are happening, like this sort of wicker chaise with two different cushions on it. There are its arms. It's one of those wicker and metal sort of folding chairs that you would put outside. It's been brought indoors, put in the corner of the room, and with the electric light that's glowing overhead, it's casting extremely powerful shadows back on the corner of the room. That notion of lighting and the direction in which lighting will go then makes it impossible to turn this painting any way but this way up. And it's a square painting, and I can tell you I tried it in every direction, because it is a painting that will not sit still. It's one of Bonnard's most remarkable compositions. It's a good thing that it belongs to the Pompidou Center in Paris. It's an extraordinarily modern painting in which everything is something that we can identify. Well, we might have a little trouble figuring out exactly what things are, but we know that it's a basket and a plate with grapes on it and it's some kind of box. We know that this thing is a chair, even though it seems to be the Honey, I Shrunk the Chair chair over in the upper left-hand corner. It's an incredibly exciting painting when you see it in person, as I urge you to do sometime, either in Washington or Paris. And side by side, one painting in which the same basket sits very handily on the tabletop, and this other one in which it seems to want to float, side by side, they were pretty exciting. As were this beautiful bouquet of mimosas and this intensely colored still life from 1945. Both of these were painted in 1945, the year before he died. You might not be surprised that Matisse lived with the basket of fruit in exchange for Matisse lending Bonnard his wonderful painting of a model in a purple coat called Asia that is at the collection of the Kimbell Art Museum. They exchanged paintings for a while in 1946. And Bonnard sent this one down to Nice to Matisse, and Nice sent his painting up to Bonnard to hang in this very room against the ochre yellow walls. Now we're going to leave the public spaces of the house behind, and we're going to go into the most private areas of Bonnard's imagination. Marthe de Méligny, she was neither named Marthe nor de Méligny, but she went by that name when they first met in 1893. Her real name was Maria Boursin. She was a country girl, and she had come to Paris and was working in some way in the artificial flower trade. We think maybe making flowers. She was a girl of a different social sphere from Bonnard. Bonnard was the son of a civil servant who had been well educated. He had an education of his own, a serious education, before he became an art student. And Maria, Marthe, didn't pursue these same ideas. It's thought, perhaps, that though their life together was intensely fulfilling and evidently rewarding for both of them, that there was perhaps a class issue in her relationship with his friends, and that over time she became less and less interested in seeing any of them, became a bit sort of misanthropic. But there is a tenderness in this wonderful painting of her with her black stocking with the red garter, or in this painting where she has fallen asleep. He's walked into the room, he sees her asleep, he doesn't wake her, he backs away, but not before he has the memory fixed in his head so that he can paint it in this incredibly intimate painting. And these two, painted in almost the same time, hung side by side. And these images contrast with this magnificent painting from the art gallery, the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, the longest journey that any painting took to come to the Kimbell for Bonnard's Worlds, all the way from the other end of the world. This magnificent woman lying in bed, a painting of Marthe lying in bed. You can see when you look at it that she's a little bit awake. She's a little bit aware of our presence. And it hung opposite this more famous painting, because it's in Paris at the Musée d'Orsay, called Man and Woman, in which he paints himself with Marthe. There she is. Clearly, in both paintings, there's a sense of love just having been made. There's a sense of intimacy and privacy. And these paintings hung, as I said, opposite each other, and with other pictures in which the model is very much vulnerable in a way, naked, perhaps almost unaware of our presence, typically absorbed in her own activities. The great example of this is this magnificent painting from Brussels called The Bathroom or The Dressing Room, but its original title was Eau de Cologne. And a friend of mine figured it out for me, that the reason why her hand is up in front of her breast, her left hand in front of her breast, is that she's got the bulb of the cologne bottle, and she's spraying herself with cologne, and she's holding it out in front of her to cover her body with cologne, and that's why her head is lifted up too, so it doesn't fall into her eyes. This same view she's seen in the mirror here, but of course the mirror doesn't particularly reflect exactly what's in front of it, no more than this patch of reflection here in this shallow tub reflects anything that looks like the window above. And here, Marthe seems to be seen twice. Someone said, well, who's the other person in the picture? I said, well, it's probably just her twice, because the whole thing is made up. The whole thing is observed, but composed from nature and from memory afterwards. I think one of the most ravishingly beautiful paintings in the exhibition, which did not go on to the Phillips Collection, is this one called The Spring, recently acquired by the Bayerler Foundation in Rien, outside Basel in Switzerland. This is an extraordinarily beautiful painting of Marthe, the first ever in which she is shown in a bathtub, and painted, we think, about 1916 or 17. And it takes its name, the spring, in French, la source, and it's the notion of the spring that rises up and gives birth to a river or a body of water. There's a famous painting by Ingres of a woman standing with an ever-flowing urn that's just gushing water forever, a kind of the notion of a fountain that has a woman standing beside a source of water that comes out, and the notion of the beginning of something, and the flowing, and the idea of moving water is really critical to this painting, in which the face of Marthe, with these very enigmatic eyes, is juxtaposed with the most beautiful rendition of her hands. And they are placed beneath the running water of the tap. And she's holding her fingers out under this water, and it is among the most sensual paintings I know, because it's in it is a sense, almost every sense is invoked. You get this notion of the sound of the water, the touch of it, almost the smell of it, the taste of the water, and of course, the notion of our eyes looking into hers, the idea of sight, and then inevitably also the sense that our hands might reach out and touch her body. That is invoked again in this beautiful painting from a few years later, where again the notion of hands and gestures in this beautiful rendition of Marthe standing, sort of drying herself or maybe drying between her toes. It's kind of hard to know what she's doing. It's equal parts Degas dancer and Degas bather in this gorgeous painting that belongs to a private collection in New York. This whole part of the exhibition is, whether at the Phillips Collection or in Fort Worth, among the most beautiful sections of the show, because the bathers that Bonnard paints are truly among his most accomplished works. It's a subject that he didn't come to until around 1900s. It's not in his first decade, and it really only happens in earnest after after the First World War, when the idea of the bather and the nude becomes a dominant theme in his art. Here are two paintings from Philadelphia and Washington, and another, again, never on view, at the Museum of Modern Art, in which you see the bathroom that is adjacent to that room with the French door in the upstairs of the house in the south of France. It sounds a little bit like this is the house that Jack built, but this is the bathroom that was built by Marthe and Pierre Bonnard when they renovated Le Bosquet, the house in Le Canet, in 1926. They installed tile on the walls. The tiles are white in spite of the fact that they look blue or dark blue here. The floor was not blue and white tile, as it is now, because they couldn't, when they needed to replace the original flooring, which was linoleum, they couldn't get blue and white linoleum, so they had to use real tile. All of the furniture that you see in the painting on the screen now is present still in that room. The little table, the little sort of bent wood stool, the tub itself, the sink, and you see the window, which is closed here with the outside shutters also closed, and a curtain drawn halfway across. And the whole notion of the way light is penetrating the room through this closed window, while there must be an open window just to our immediate right, as there is in the room, is one of the glories of this painting. That this scene, that tub, became the locus of three of Bonnard's greatest works, which I have to say I am inordinately proud that we had them all three together for the first time in America in 25 years in Fort Worth. Alas, they're not all together in Washington. Two came from Europe. The one at the left is from the Modern Art Museum of the city of Paris, bought from Bonnard directly by that museum in the 1930s, not delivered to them until he had begun a second version of it. And in fact, he borrowed it back, we think, to perfect the second version, which is in a private collection in Europe as well. The most magnificent, in my view, is this one from the Modern Art Museum of the city of Paris, where the white tiles on the wall have achieved a kind of prismatic color range, and where the blue and white linoleum floor has begun to glow like lapis and gold. The floor gets even more excited in the second painting, the second version of the painting, not a copy or a replica, but an evolution from the first. He's made the tub much bigger so that the figure seems smaller, The tub occupies a greater portion of the painting. It's more like a half of the picture rather than a third. And the room has become brighter altogether. There's a photograph of this painting being worked on not in the south of France, but in Normandy, in a rented room with a brightly, almost like William Morris pattern wallpaper behind it. And Bonnard tacked his paintings to the wall to paint them rather than stretching them. He painted them, and only when they were done would he finally stretch them onto a wooden canvas stretcher. An extraordinary thing to have the three of these side by side, two that really are twins of each other, and a third, the one from an American museum from Pittsburgh, from the Carnegie Museum of Art, in which we know he began it by 1941. There's a photograph of it, but it was still in his studio when he died. In between, Marthe, who, remember, is almost 70 years old when these paintings were being made, but never ages. She never does change. And people have constructed all kinds of improbable scenarios, calling these paintings sarcophagi for the dying Marthe. I think that's a lot of hooey. And I think they are extraordinary hymns to love and tenderness and affection for someone with whom you have lived by the time he's painting these 40 or 50 years. The dog there beside her, whether in this painting or in the one from the Museum of Modern Art, which is manifestly also a symbol of fidelity and the notion of belonging to each other, I think is critical to understanding this group of works. Well, you would think that peering on someone in the bath might be the most private place you could go in someone's world, but I think it's actually not. I think it's when the person is by himself that it's at the most private. And Bonnard is a uncompromising painter of self-portraits. They are rarely flattering. They're never flattering. And they are often probing. Whether this one, in which he seems to cast himself as a kind of wild man with this extraordinary expressionistic background. This one from about 10 years later, perhaps, which he titled it The Boxer, when it was first exhibited in the 1930s in a major exhibition at his gallery in Paris. A painting where he seems so vulnerable. You can see he's skinny, his chest is bony, his face is beginning to sink a little bit. He still has hair on his head, but he raises a fist almost, or raises a hand in a kind of impotent gesture. This is no pugilist. This is no strong boxer. This is a man that, if he's fighting, is fighting against, fighting for creativity, perhaps, or fighting against the notion maybe of growing old. But I think he's not afraid of growing old necessarily. Look at this painting. This is among the last of them. This is 1945. He dies in 1947. He sends this painting and has it actually published in a book in 1946. And it is really a painting of himself, but it's also a painting of a mirror. Do you see? Do you see the mirror with its sort of little blue edge? The sink below this glass shelf, a brush, a little bottle of cologne perhaps there, the cupboards of his dressing room. This is painted The scene is the dressing room that was his room, not Mart's bathroom, but his dressing room, and where there was a wall-mounted sink for him to shave at. This is him by himself, looking at himself, but presenting himself to us, looking sort of, as I say, vulnerable, but tender and resigned, and in these beautiful eyes, really looking out at us and saying, here I am, look at me, I'm Pierre Bonnard. Thank you very much. Questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
If anyone has any questions, we'll have a few moments for questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, we don't have a microphone.
Yeah.
I think in a way it's irrelevant. I'm quite interested to know if he used photography at all, or if he took photographs.
Right. The question was whether Bonnard used photography at all or whether he took photographs. Charlie, I can just kind of repeat the question, and that'll work. Yes, he did. He was and there's a wonderful exhibition about the Nabis and other artists in photography called Snapshot that was done about 12 years ago, maybe, and it's a wonderful book and exhibition. And he had a Brownie camera, a Kodak, the kind of camera that you sent the whole box back, and then you got another box back loaded with new film, and you got little tiny prints, and they weren't enlarged from the size of the film. They were like contact prints, tiny little things, and he did use those. He didn't use them for long. He used them for he took pictures of himself, and Mart took pictures of him, and he took pictures of her naked in the garden, and he used those for a book illustration project that he did. But after about 1910, they kind of go away. But that doesn't mean that he hasn't learned how a lens looks at things differently than the eye does, because he is often trying to find unconventional ways of framing a picture. You have seen that again and again as you looked at the compositions, the brilliant compositions that he makes up. And some of those, I think, might well have been conditioned, shall we say, by an awareness of how photographs behave differently than the human eye. Yes?
I wonder if you noticed and then later concluded anything about his brush strokes. I was trying to look, it seemed to me there were longer smears to the sides of the bathtub and then jobs to the tiles.
Yeah, the bathroom tiles are really extraordinary, particularly the one from Pittsburgh, for instance. To do that, he lays down with a brush a checker pattern. And then he goes in and very, very, very thinly, very, very dilute paint kind of colors in the square. And then he goes back and he puts something else on top of that. And so, yes, liquid, very liquid paint, sometimes puddling up, sometimes not so liquid, but very on a brush so dry that all you're getting is just a little bit of the paint. But he'll take the brush and rub it around and kind of rub the paint into the fabric almost, so that it's a half tone, if you will. It's not at full volume. And then he'll come in and put something on top of that that's much thicker and more opaque, and sometimes actually having a bit of texture. In general, he's a pretty thin painter. There's not that much texture on his built up on the surfaces, unlike his friend Monet, for instance, who was a big texture maker. And they were friends, just as he and Monet and Matisse were friends. And he tends to paint fairly thinly, fairly flatly, but with delicate. The French use the word empattement, impasto, but really delicate, like a Chardin. It's you can't see it without looking at it. And you'll see when the Garden with Small Bridge goes back on view, it's a very thinly painted picture, but very complex. It's not the fact that it's very thin doesn't mean that it's simplistic. It's very very thoughtfully done.
Could you see a difference between the brush strokes for the skin and what would be on mirror?
Yes, yes. So there often are differentiated like that, and in one of the paintings that you saw in that view, the sort of plunging view with the kind of flat wall with calligraphic strokes all over it. There you get a real sense of the brush just having fun, he's just literally going at it and putting it down and not going back for a second try. But in some of the paintings you can see him, Picasso railed about how indecisive he thought Bonnard was, and Picasso hated the way Bonnard painted. And I think he thought that Bonnard was a sissy because he didn't paint the painting all at once, like a man would do. And instead, Bonnard paints a painting over the course of years, and he comes back to it and makes an adjustment. And for Picasso, that was being namby-pamby. For Bonnard, it was about thinking about it over time and realizing that you could improve it by very careful adjustment. Yes?
Not being an artist, is there any reason why he painted the canvas before he stretched it?
We don't have any testimony on that, but we know it happened because there are photographs from across quite a long time of works in progress by Bonnard that are simply tacked up on the studio wall or, like I said, on the wall of a rented room in Normandy with ugly wallpaper and a big nude by Bonnard tacked on top of it. I wonder whether he liked I'm just trying to imagine that, having done some painting myself, when something is up against a flat surface and you push at it, it doesn't bounce in the way that a stretched canvas will, which has a bit of a spring to it. And it has a different effect. First of all, it will give, but then it becomes hard. Because the canvas certainly is loose against the wall. First, it'll go in a little bit, but then it stops. So it's bound to be a different physical experience than if you paint on a stretched canvas. And he said he liked the variability of the format. And indeed, in the exhibition, I didn't go into it now, but I think there's some paintings that have been stretched to the wrong size because they were not stretched by him, and they were only stretched after he died. And one of them, I think, has lines where he intended for it to be stretched, and it's got about 3 inches at the top that shouldn't be visible. Unfortunately, they put the stamp of his studio on those 3 inches, so they will never be turned over. But if you look at it in Photoshop, it seems to be much better without it. Yes, sir.
One last question.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Bonnard's career extended through both the First World War and the Second World War.
That's right.
Is there anything in his work that suggests these traumas that are going on in his country?
Remarkably little. I think that there are I think that the painting that I showed you of the terrace, which was painted in 1918, is painted at a time when there's the sense that France is going to win, and that there's a bit of optimism, and so the painting then is finished in 1918, but not exhibited until 1919, when they have the first big post-World War I art exhibition in Paris in the fall of 1919. The privations that he suffered in Vichy, then German-occupied south of France, where there was very little in the way of meat to eat, for instance. But he wrote to Matisse. Matisse kept saying, come down to Nice, check in the Hotel Regina with me. It's great, there's a lot of food, everything's fine. And he said, no, that wouldn't do for me at all. Bonnard, it was, a friend of his said that a certain degree of discomfort suited him. And so I think that those, that glorious painting of Marthe, a kind of memorial painting of her in the tub, which he's still working on in the year after the war, is bound to be influenced by a sort of sense of relief. And those fruit paintings from 1945 are also bound to be about the notion of things are going to be better now. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. Thank you.